says, get that India. Big boy.
Call an ambulance! Maybe call a police! Oh, what a shot! What a shot! Campbell Killer!
Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Tip Sheet podcast. Joining me for all things NRL and news this week are my good mates Sixites and Clint. Boys, how you doing?
Well, mate, I'm doing pretty well. It's always a pleasure to be here on the world's best Parramatta Eels theme podcast. Look, it's not something we talk about, but apparently a lot of other people talk about that. So it's good to be here again. Clint, how you doing, mate?
I'm pretty great, gents. And look, you know, the audience are only human for having those thoughts. But, you know, what a weekend it's been. Certainly for the Parramatta Eels, maybe not so much for the Newcastle Knights. We'll get into that a little bit later. But, yeah, feeling pretty good.
And before we roll into it, boys, as always, a quick shout out to our sponsors, Big Swing Golf, Northmead, and star partners, NRL and Auburn and Parramatta. Parramatta couldn't do the podcast without them. And what's that? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Or is it time for...
News team, assemble!
And for all the news and action for Parramatta and the NRL from rounds 9 to 10, I defer to you, 60s. Take it away, mate.
Well, mate, just before we start that, a quick mention that this Sunday at the home of the Eels Parramatta Leagues Club, there will be a live away site set up at the club, sort of similar to what happened in the preliminary finals and the grand final last year. And we will be in Jack's Bar and Grill for the Parramatta versus Titans game, bit of a pre-game show and an instant reaction at the end. So if you'd like to get along to the home of the Eels Parramatta Leagues Club, make sure you're there. You'll catch not only the game, but you'll catch us there as part of the Eels festivities. So, fellas, a huge weekend, as we said, for Parramatta Eels supporters. And, of course, it kicked off on Friday night with that massive win against the Knights, the one that threw in the disrespectful field goal at the end. We love that disrespectful field goal. Mostly when we kick it. No, let me rephrase that. Only when we kick it. So what's our learnings from Friday night? Clint, what's your main take?
Well, my main take is our team continued to, I won't say the word dumbfound or even surprised, but you know, I didn't go into Friday night expecting a 13-plus victory. I think we were all a little bit cagey and being cautiously optimistic last week in our preview, and I came away completely surprised with the result, particularly when you consider not only RCG being out, but Ryan Madison was a late withdrawal as well. But geez, didn't the boys stand up? They were very impressive, and you know, we also left some points out there.
I think the words you were looking for was that they challenge your expectations.
Thank you for putting that so succinctly.
Yes. What about you, John?
Yeah, I mean, we spoke about it in the post-game 60s, one of the more bizarre games I've attended in terms of how freely Parramatta are able to attack against Newcastle, but also how many points are left out there. Any game where you've got more line breaks and your opposition has points is a doozy, and that was the case here. Some standout performances from the likes of Will Penasini and some of those forwards was very good. Makatoa and Ogden probably having career days out there. And the big question is going to be for those two is, were they one-offs or can they harness more of that energy moving forwards as the Eels look to fill that gap that is Reagan Campbell-Gillard?
Yeah, and I think for me the main take was that a couple of players set new standards, new benchmarks for themselves. And like you just said then, the question mark is it something that they are capable of repeating? And if it is something they're capable of repeating, then we're in a good place in terms of our backup players or interchange. But, of course, there's a saying that I'm going to start to use, which is you're only as good as your next game. Not you're only as good as your last game, you're only as good as your next game. And from the Eels' perspective, we always need that next game to be a winning game and the best possible performance that any of the players can put in for the team. Now that was perhaps just the curtain raiser, fellas, because the big event from the weekend was out there at Leichhardt Oval, a bit of a damp Leichhardt Oval, but it was certainly happy days for the Parramatta Eels SG ball team. Clint?
What an impressive game it was. There was a handful of performances out there, but we touched on a few weeks ago about that club spirit that exists throughout the grades, and we continue to see that on show again through the SG Ball Grand Final. Some real gritty performances from the players in that side, and then echoing the sentiments of that club mentality. What about the celebrations after the match, where they were the winners were greeted by the first graders in the change rooms? That's certainly an image that'll live on in my memory for a little while yet. But really wonderful performances, gents. Ethan Sanders got man of the match, but you could have just as easily given it to Matt Arthur. He had some real game-turning moments. That 40-20 followed up by the try assist, a minute or two later. Really, really pivotal in swinging some important momentum back our way when, and I guess a pesky Newcastle side just wouldn't go away.
John?
Yeah, I mean, it capped off a tremendous final series for the Parramatta Eels, starting with that fast and frenetic game against the Western Suburbs Magpies, backed into such a complete performance against the minor premiers and the Canberra Raiders. And they really brought that same energy to the game at Leichhardt on Saturday. Newcastle refused to go away, but the Parramatta Eels were in control of this game from start to finish. Both the halves laid on identical tries using their back rowers. Dom Farouja on the left with Sanders, Charlie Geimer on the right with Josh Lynn. That got the Eels out to that 12-0 start. Newcastle fought their way back. It looked like the tide was sort of turning in the second half with some less than kind refereeing, I suppose is probably the nicest way of putting it. But the Eels managed to turn the tides with that aforementioned 40-20 and try assist to Woods that you spoke about there, Clint. And this was really a team effort. You go through that team list, each one of those 13 starting players made significant contributions. I thought Devontae Vivella, who the week before against Canberra dropped a couple of try-scoring opportunities. Well, in this game, he iced his two chances. He got two in that game, and he took both of them, including a bounce pass from Upper Tweedle. So really happy to see him bounce back and really pay back the coach's faith in taking that selection over some other choices on the wing. Mohamed Al-Madine, well, he had a fantastic defusal right at the depth there. They went for that crossfield kick, and he just went up AFL style and came down with it. Both the centres were excellent. Penasini scoring a try, Blaise Talangi just being strong throughout the entire game. And their off-the-ball work was really good too. Their kick chases were aggressive on those attacking kicks, and you love to see that. In the front row, I thought Lance Fulima was very good. Sam Tuivasa, he was my best on field. Junior year of eligibility in the SG Ball, he was a man amongst, other hulking young men. But, he was the one that was setting the tone. And, he was so good. Dom Bestratus, Charlie Geimer, Saxon Pryke were tireless. All the interchange boys did their jobs too. No one was a superstar off the interchange, but they all did their jobs. So it was a fantastic team performance and, caps off a very good, barring the losses to Penrith and Canberra, a very good campaign. And, full credit to all the coaching staff and head coach Steve O'Day. They've done a wonderful job with this group of very talented young men.
Basically, you'd have to say the coaching staff had the Eels primed for their best performances when they hit the final series.
Yep,
absolutely.
The defensive resolve during the final series is what stood out for me. We've had a lot of the fine moments from the individual players. You rattled off Sam, you rattled off Ethan Sanders and Matt Arthur, and they had really strong performances through the final series. But you also referenced that every player did their job, and I think that was key to the finals series, is that every player did their job. And most importantly, they did their job in defence. I mean, they really turned up for each other in that defensive result, right on the try line. Their defence on the try line was as good as you're going to see from any rugby league team. It was just that they just refused to yield. And even the try, one of the tries there that the Knights scored, I mean, it was arguable that the bloke was held up, and he wriggled out. It seemed like the Eels players sort of eased a little bit when they were holding him up, and then he sort of wriggled. I think they were expecting the ref's call. Then again, you've got to wait till the call is made. So, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in terms of where you either say that how the try was able to be scored or whether the try was allowed to be scored. But that aside, all the opponents had to work to score their tries. And in that grand final, the Newcastle Knights, when they were making their surges, that was on the back of extreme flows of possession. Like real extreme flows of possession. And I'm not taking away from the Knights because they just kept coming back, and they've got some really good players who will be NRL players in that team. And they had a couple of players that were out as well. So we have to give them credit on a good season and being a good team. But if not for those significant flows of possession, we're talking about penalties, repeat sets, charge downs where the ball bounced their way. It was their tries were being scored on the back of like the third, fourth, fifth set in that flow. So I honestly felt that the Eels were the far superior team out there on the field against a team that, as I said, just were dogged in that they just refused to give up against the Eels. But I think the Eels were deserved winners, and but it was just a Parramatta thing that we had to sit on the edge of the seat till the end of the game, wasn't it? So
Eagles law.
But look, you mentioned the celebrations in the sheds. It was great, those celebrations at the end. I mean, thanks to Eels Media for capturing all of that. So
it was great to see that connection.
Imagine what it would have been like being in the sheds, and there's the NRL fellas there waiting to join in your celebrations.
It was a really great connection to see, and I know I've had a good portion of this SG Borg team. Penasini, Talangi, Sanders. I think did both Forlima and Tuivasa do the preseason, or just one of them?
Both of them did the preseason.
Arthur and Geimer and maybe Saxon all did that pre-Christmas preseason. So there was a strong connection there to the first grade team, and to see them turn up for their big day and celebrate that moment in the sheds with them is really a treasured memory for these boys moving forwards.
Yeah, and we like to think that the Parramatta players, as many of them as possible, are para-aspirational. And I tell you what, those sorts of moments when the NRL players look just as invested, just as excited about the victory as they were, that goes a long way towards having great unity within the club. But of course, they weren't the only two victories over the weekend. We did see the New South Wales Cup team bounce back in emphatic fashion, also against the Newcastle Knights, and a not too dissimilar score to the NRL team, winning 44 points to 10. Clint, that's an amazing turnaround for the New South Wales Cup team, who are on the receiving end of quite a big hiding the week before.
Well, we spoke about exceeding expectations before. Certainly New South Wales Cup falls into that category. A complete 180 from the game against the Warriors over in New Zealand. Some really good performances all around within that side. There was a few doubles throughout the Eels scorers. We saw many Luke, who's come in at a hooker, get a double. I think Zach Sini and Matt Dury did as well. Some real strong performances in the forwards. Andrew Davey, in his first game back in Eels colours, doing quite well. Likewise, Matt himself, Zach Sini as well, obviously getting the double. Watching the highlights back as well, what a run from Jack Murchie to set up the last try.
That was a nice try, wasn't it? Yeah.
Those are the type of signs that you want to see from the reserve grade side, and those players who are part of the NRL squad. applying that type of pressure. And it becomes even more important when we talk about players being out, and hopefully that's the type of performance that can create a little bit of confidence within the players in that grade, and much like we said to the likes of Makatoa and Ogden, a new expectation has been set. That's the foundation performance. You keep playing to that level, and for a handful of those boys, they well and truly come back into to contention and consideration for an NRL, and as they should. So hopefully this is the performance that really kickstarts it for the Cup side. Obviously, they were playing the last place Newcastle team in that grade, but sometimes you just need one win, boys.
And John, the performance of Manny Luke, is he related to Sonny Luke?
Yeah, I think we got the Fox Sports weekend wrap for the New South Wales Cup, and they referred to Manny as the younger brother. So we finally get that connection put together, which also we sort of speculated, given he came out of the Penrith district. But yes, the younger brother of Sonny, I think. So he actually looked pretty sharp on the highlight reel there. So good to see a bit of attacking threat out of dummy half of the Parramatta Eels in this game. And Newcastle, they had just a one win in the season coming into this game. They were last coming into round 9. Last exiting round 9. So Eels doing what they had to do, and like Clint said, hopefully this is a get-right game for them after a tough couple of weeks.
Yeah, and you mentioned what you saw from Manny Luke in the highlights. Yeah, very couple of tries there. He looked very sharp at training during the week last week. I hadn't seen much of him. We weren't able to. There was obviously a clash of times because the New South Wales Cup was being played at a similar time to the SG Ball grand final out at Leichhardt, and we were out at Leichhardt, so we couldn't be up at Kellyville. But the highlights, he certainly looked sharp there. He looked sharp at training. The other, you mentioned that run from Jack Murchie. He was almost channeling the ghost of Brett Kenny in that run, turn and play inside and out as they're running backwards. And also, for those who always quick to criticise Jake Arthur and his pace, when that kick was put forward, Jake was nowhere in the picture for his try, and he scooted past all the players that were chasing after the ball to touchdown on the kick. I think the kick came from Rankin from memory. So good to see him showing some of the critics just he has got a little bit of toe. He's not the most conventional runner that you'd ever see, but he is a competitor and he's always keeps himself in that moment in a game. So well done to Jake there. But before we get to the actual team list this week, there's a little bit of signing news. So we had Sean Russell re-signed to, I think it's the end of 2025, isn't it, Clint?
Yep, a 2-year extension for Sean, and continues the mantra of the development club that the Parramatta Eels espouse. I might just circle back, I should say, 60s. You mentioned Jordan Rankin with the kick there in New South Wales Cup. Jordan was actually at the SG Ball Grand Final as well. So we talk about a one-in, all-in club mentality. This is maybe some of the things that the everyday fan doesn't see because it's not captured on film. But obviously he has a role with the club, and that's well documented. But making the effort after playing the game at Kellyville and getting across to
that's seriously
second half
impressive.
grand finals, phenomenal effort.
Yeah.
The signing of the re-signing of Sean Russell again, just it echoes the culture that exists within the club that I guess maybe people don't necessarily see. It's not something that you can tangibly touch, but when you see little pockets of these things and really good news stories like Sean re-signing, it sends an external message about what's going on at this club.
Bittersweet week for Sean, though, wasn't it? Gets the good news that he's sticking on for a couple of years, then gets the call into the coach's office, mate, I'm sorry, but you're not making the team this week. So that's how football and professional sports go. He gets the far more important good news, I would say, there, knowing that his career is secure at Parramatta until the end of 2025.
Well, Sean wasn't the only signing news. We had more of the Parramatta's NRLW signings announced. The sides slowly starting to take shape. Can you run us through those signings, please, Clint?
Yeah, well, over the course of the last week, the club announced Elsie Albert from the St. George Illawarra Dragons. Very impressive front row forward. Gents, I'm personally watching the NRLW over the last 2 seasons. She's been a player of note that's really stood out and been a driving force behind a successfully performing St. George side. Likewise, we announced the signing of Nakia Davis-Welsh, and a handful of re-signings with Zali Faye, Abby Church, Ruben Sherrington, the sister of Kennedy, joining her sister at the Mighty Eels. There's also the rumoured re-signing of Cassie Tohiku, who, depending on which is your go-to source of rugby league on the internet, we're waiting official confirmation of that. But they all join Kennedy Sherrington and Rachel Pearson within the NRLW squad for 2023 and beyond.
Yeah,
And I guess we're also waiting on news about what's going to happen around Tiana Penatani also.
because she was a 2-year signing from last year, wasn't she? So she would still have a year under contract, but we have to wait and see if that whole mad scramble over the contract's being voided or anything like that. But, yeah, good moves. I mean, Elsie is a real tone setter in the forward pack. Alongside Kennedy, they're going to be the 2 real pillars of the Parramatta ruck. So really nice to see that. And I've got to say, while we haven't made a lot of splashy signings, there's been some good logic to the players that we have picked up externally. Pearson is obviously your control tower at number 7. Albert helps set the tempo and the tone in the middle with Kennedy. And then you get some really solid re-signings around there alongside the pickup of David. Was it Davis? Is that it?
Davis-Welsh.
Davis-Welsh,
yes.
Yeah.
But she's transitioned from being a fullback when she was playing earlier in the women's game, and I think she had time out to have a family.
Two children, I believe, yeah.
Yes, and now she's returning, but I believe she's going to be returning as a forward.
Yeah, so maybe she could be that sort of modern-day ball-playing lock forward behind the platform that Elsie and Kennedy set up. Yeah,
so it becomes interesting then, who will Parramatta announce as a fullback signing? It's
is the fullback already at the club? Maybe.
Well, I guess we have to see whether there's going to be an announcement of someone being an internal announcement, or whether it's going to be an external recruitment. But we're talking about, I think the pre-season is due to start. I think the squads have to be fully named by the end of this month, if I'm correct on that. I'm pretty sure at the end of May.
Are we going to announce a top 18 or something in spirit and in solidarity for our NRL team?
Yeah, look, it's speaking to some club sources. The landscape has completely changed for the NRLW, because in the women's game, even in the pathways, the agents are now involved big time.
Anyone that had to listen to our chat with Nathan Brown last week when we were previewing the SG Ball Grand Final, and even the chat we had before him earlier in the year, knows that the pathways are now shockingly competitive. And yeah, you want to keep the players you have on your books, whether it's a young lad or a young lady, but it's just not easy anymore. And the NRLW has had a 4-team expansion wave, which means that it's essentially chum in the water for these sharks to come feasting.
Well, mate, I might just keep your thoughts rolling here, because Parramatta players will come further into the spotlight, because there are quite a number of them that have been named in the city teams, and especially in the female pathways.
Yeah, you give Quinn all the easy ones. Yeah, I see how it is. We were talking about at the conclusion of full-time the SG Ball whether they'll be naming the junior rep teams, the junior rep teams, at Leichhardt, because in years past they would name the New South Wales squads, but obviously with a move back to City Country, they've pushed it back to the end of the next week. So on the men's side, or the young men's side, the Eels have representatives in the 16s and 18s for the New South Wales, or the City under 16s, because the way these are structured is Harold Matz and SG Ball take the City side, Laurie Daly and Andrew John squads take the country side now. So on the City side for the Eels in the 16s men's, Mason Ong, Larima Rokasuka, Lockie Vella all got picked. So they're all junior year eligibility in their Harold Matthews seasons. A couple of outside backs there in Rokasuka and Vela, and obviously Mason Ong's a big prop forward. All had very good seasons. In the 18s, boys or men's, Richard Penasini, Blaze Talangi, and Sam Tulavati all get selection, and you won't hear a single naysayer, I think, to any of those picks, but the player that's got to be desperately unlucky there, boys, is Matt Arthur. I know there was another good dummy half picked, obviously ahead of him in... if I can just find
Talon De Silva.
Talon De Silva. But surely you'd find space for two dummy halves there, especially for the grand final winning player.
Look, I think not only has Matt Arthur been exceptional for the Parramatta Eels, but he's been an exceptional player in the competition, and he outplayed his opponents all through the final series, including Talon De Silva.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a knock on
No,
Talon.
it's not a slight on Talon. It's just that Matt had a
not at
tremendous
all.
campaign.
It's more a comment that it was very unlucky. Now, he's with Matt Arthur. We're talking about someone who does qualify age-wise, because having it as 16s and 18s makes it interesting, because the Harold Matthews goes up to 17 years of age, and the SG Ball goes to 18 years of age. So the players that are being selected would be a combination of players who are in the young age group for the Harold Matthews, the 16-year-olds that are there. So if you're wondering why there are certain players, say in the Parramatta team or other teams, that have been standouts in that competition that weren't selected, they were probably 17 years of age. And likewise in the with the under 18s team, with the SG Ball going up to 19 years of age.
So you got junior and senior years of eligibility, and the ones in the senior years don't get picked in these teams.
Yes, that's it. So it's interesting that there are that they've kept those age groups,
but there will be New South Wales 19 selection for at least the SG Ball players later on in the year, I believe. I don't know.
Yeah, but it seems strange, however, doesn't it, that the city country doesn't fall into alignment with the state selection. So for whatever, I'm sure there is a valid reason.
Maybe it's because of schoolboys, because in year 12 most of them are going to be under 18s. I don't know.
Oh, I guess Look, I guess that comes in, but that's an entirely different competition, isn't it? Based on school performance.
We have to maybe poke around and find out why that is.
So,
representative honours flow on for the Eels on the female side of the game. And you talk about that Lisa Fiala Cup team, boys. Well, they've been rewarded for an absolutely dominant campaign with 9, I believe, of the 18 players picked for the New South Wales under-17s squad.
Now, see, they fit in with the ages.
Yes. So the
under-17s and under-19s. So sorry for interrupting there.
But we start with Rivalry Alo. Then we have Waiaria Ellis, Maria Fasavalu Farmasili. Then we have Tia Matthews and Logan Lamusu. Moving on, we also have Danielle Sekold. And then there's the two Toya sisters, Odetsa and Alianne. And then Fontaine Tefua to round it out with the coach. Deservedly, and a real honest applause, or round of applause here, boys, for Charlotte Henry, who is not just a wonderful coach, but a wonderful member of the Parramatta Eels family, and she's getting her much-deserved plaudits here coaching the city team.
Look, we're biased. We get because we're big fans of Shah, not only for the coaching that she puts in, and can I just say as well that she's volunteers extra time helping out up at the Kellyville Bush Rangers as well. And her husband, Milo, he's involved with Pathways. And on top of all of that, they are the house parents in the Parramatta house. Like so said, the young players
incredible members of the Parramatta family.
Yeah, from Queensland that are staying there in the Parramatta house. And, you couldn't have, Shah and Milo and their family. You couldn't have better people for these young players to stay within the Parramatta house. So, that's terrific news there. And it seemed like you were almost naming an entire team.
Well, half the team was Parramatta Eels. And I've got to say the Bulldogs also have good representation in this team. So going to be a fierce rivalry between the two teams in the Tarsha Gale, it looks like. And speaking of Tarsha Gale, 4 reps from that team making the under-19s city team. No surprises among the 4 players here picked, boys. Talara Bambutt, Debbie Dewey, Ashley Pottinger, and the outstanding centre, Lindsay Tui. All 4 players had very good individual seasons, all worthy of selection, so well done to all and sundry.
Absolutely. So there's plenty that's been happening in Paradise, and I guess the only thing we need to go over now, mate, is the team list news.
Yeah, well, let's get right into it with the NRL Round 10 team list announcement. Players in and players out, a bit of action and transaction. Starting at fullback, we've got Captain Quinton Gufferson, Micah Sevo, and Hayes Dunster holding their places on the wings. Obviously, no doubt about Micah, but for Hayes, there was probably a bit of a question mark about who would be the player missing out with the return of one Bailey Simonson, who makes his return in the centres alongside Will Penasini. Sean Russell, the man to miss out. In the halves, Dylan Brown, Mitchell Moses, unchanged as expected. In the front row, unchanged as expected. Wiramu Greg doing a great job partnering Junior Barlaw. Josh Hodgson will be the dummy half. In the back row, though, we do have a bit of a surprise, boys. Sean Lane holding down that left edge alongside Dylan. But Andrew Davey, well, he gets jettisoned straight into a starting position just 1 week after joining the club, which pushes Bryce Cartwright and Ryan Madison to the bench because Jermaine Hopgood is the starting lock forward. So Cardi on the bench alongside Maddo, Casey Makatoa, and Brendan Hands. So I suppose the implication here being that we're going to have a platoon on the right edge between Andrew Davey and Bryce Cartwright, freeing up Ryan Madison to reinforce that weakened middle where he'll work alongside Greg, Barlaw, and Makatoa. The extended roster, though, in case there are any changes this week: Jake Arthur, Sean Russell, Offa Ogden, Matt Dury, and Jack Murchie. Chris Butler, the referee here, boys. One of those refs we actually have a pretty good record under, so that's a nice little boost for.
I wish you hadn't said that.
Well, look, it's been counteracted. It's been
Eels ball.
counteracted by the Suncorp turf, which we'll get to shortly. So Eels need everything in their corner this week, boys, and if Butler's going to help us get there, then so be it.
Before we get on to the New South Wales Cup team, Clint, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, the big news is obviously Andrew Davey coming back into the side. His first NRL game for the Parramatta Eels since 2020. Obviously, I think that decision's been made with defence in mind and shoring up the right edge defensively. Correct me if I'm wrong, gents, but he'll be the one marking Andrew Fafita.
Fafita runs down their left, yeah.
So, it makes sense to match a big body with a big body. And, despite the fact that Bryce has been playing incredibly well and in particular, had a highlight game last week, there was a couple of tackles he missed, and when you're playing a team that's got the attacking prowess of the Titans when they're in the mood, you want to have someone that can reliably fill that that edge defensively. And I'm sure Andrew Davies been given the remit to give it a good solid 20 to 30, and then we'll see Bryce come into the game. Likewise, Hayes retaining his spot. Look, continue with the theme of defence first. Yeah, been well documented. Hayes missed a couple of opportunities backing up some breaks from Will Penasini last week, but geez, boys, he made some really good defensive decisions and some really key tackles last week. And, that's certainly not lost on me. And I dare say he's been rewarded with that effort. And Sean Russell, the unfortunate man to miss out, but, he too had a couple of missed tackles last week. So, he's probably been given the remit to go work on that, some of those things, particularly defensively in New South Wales Cup, and get ready for another shot at first grade in coming weeks.
I think I tend to agree with your take on these being decisions based on defence, because Hayes I think he was outstanding in defence last week, and it's not just that he made half a dozen tackles without a miss, but they were key tackles, and also his defensive positioning shut down threats of attack. It's often a similar situation that I've found with Dylan Brown over the years. Yeah, Dylan makes a lot of crucial tackles and a lot of try-saving tackles, but his positioning in defence also can shut down attacking moves before they happen. And I thought that was the key over that side, that where you didn't really see those line breaks where the Knights had a couple of renowned tackle break runners. And look, I get what you're saying about Andrew Davey lining up against David Fafita. I think I'm a little bit surprised how quickly Andy's come back into the team in that regard. I think there's always a risk that a coach takes with team dynamics with that. So he's obviously sounded out, I think, the team leadership group with this as well about making this selection, because we know that Cardi's very popular with the group, and it's not like Cardi's been dropped out of the first grade team or anything like that. And in fact, after his performance last week, you'd probably be up in arms if he was dropped out of the first grade team, because for his 150th first grade game, he had a quite a ripper of a game. But I want to put this to you. This is a question that came to me via one of our listeners, Michael Formosa. And he posed the question as to whether BA has made decisions around the likes of Dunster and Davey because they didn't play in Darwin. And so and given that physically that Darwin game takes its toll in this second week, whether it was those two got the nod to be starters this week based on being a bit fresh of not having to play in Darwin.
Look, it's a very good question, Michael, and thank you for sharing that. 60s, the fact of the matter is that the club, led by the head of performance, Trent Elkin, are constantly monitoring the output of players and conducting what's known as load management. And anyone who's not familiar with that, there's a certain output that every single player is capable of. It's a metric that the performance team use, and they use that to monitor what each individual player is capable of handling up until a certain point, and then they'll make the decision to deload the amount of physical output that each of those players have to do. That might take the form in the way of sitting out training sessions. It may even take the form in terms of rotating players throughout games and making decisions around who starts and who plays how many minutes. That may very well be the case here. Of course, I'm being completely speculative, but it's a great question. That may be what's taking place here.
Yeah, it's and we were obviously talking about that a couple of weeks ago around that Darwin game, but I thought it's interesting. You know what? Even if it's not based on that, it's a decision in now thinking about it that I don't mind. I don't mind a couple of players that weren't involved in that match being selected in key positions in this game. So, but we now move on. We've got the New South Wales Cup team being successful last week, and John, you've got their team list for this week.
Yeah, and they've actually got Magic Round of their own happening out at North Sydney Oval on Sunday. 3 games there, and on Saturday I believe there was 3 games originally slated to be at Redfern but moved to Blacktown, I want to say. So Blacktown or Bankstown? I think it was Blacktown. So plenty of our Magic Round happening, although probably on a slightly small stage here for the Cup. They're taking on the Western Suburbs Magpies, who, if you remember a few weeks ago, had that absolute bludger of a win, 10-6. But they line up like this with Dejan Arce at fullback, Lumi and Chris Tupou on the wings. Sean Russell, who we spoke about, turns out in the centres with Zach Sini. In the halves, Jordan Rankin and Jake Arthur. Front row, Ofiki Ogden dropping back to the Cup, where he'll partner Jira Momasia. Manny Luke holds down his starting place at dummy half. Very strong back row, Matt Dury, Jack Murchie, Luke Kamrudi at lock forward. On the interchange, Jaden Yates and Tony Matayeli of Tavita Taumapenu, and the big hyphen, Jonte Jr., Bethan Meza. Jersey flag on the bye boys, so Jonte gets the call up to senior football once again, and rounds out a pretty big bench there with Taumapenu, Matayeli and himself providing all the beef. So a reasonably good-looking team here. Obviously, the backline not as strong as it could have been, but Tupou did a pretty good job last week, so he gets his chance again. And the Eels take on a Magpies outfit where the big stars are Dane Laurie, Will Smith. You got, after that, former Parramatta Eel prospect Tarsi James. Mania Cherrington is part of the Cherrington family, I believe. You got Tuki Mahia, Simpkins, Sean Bloor, and Sione Fainu, who I believe is beefing with the West Tigers after what happened with the West Manly game a couple of weeks ago. So I don't know. It's a game they should win, but it's not a home game, even though it is a home game. So that's going to take that away from them.
Yeah, look, it's one of those games, I think, where we just don't know how the team is going to turn out. I mean, when I say turn out, I mean turn up, I should say. The previous few weeks was not them at their best. Last week against an opponent that's not going strong, they did get to something closer to their best football. At the very least, it would have returned a bit of confidence to the players. It certainly is good to be able to sing the team song rather than be sitting there and staring at the floor in the dressing sheds or staring at each other trying to work out what went wrong. So I'm not about to make a tip on the Eels New South Wales Cup team just yet. Hopefully I might get out to one more training session this week. But Clint, any takes that you have on the team selections in New South Wales Cup?
Oh, look, they all make sense, but the challenge is to back up. They've got to back up that performance. They can't let that win against the Knights be a flash in the pan, And I'm looking at the forward pack when I say this. You got to back up your effort. They all had strong performances against the Knights. Now it's time to back that up and continue knocking down the front door of an NRL selection. We saw Ogden's good performance and probably a career game, as Forty touched on earlier in NRL last week. Prove that you want that bench spot. The same challenge goes out to guys like Matt Dury and Jack Murchie and even Jura, who has featured in first grade. There are spots there for players who perform. So give the coach every possible headache and every possible reason to consider you.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we move on to NRL news. We just covered the news in paradise. It's NRL news time. And we're going to start off with, I'm going to link it to our Team List Tuesday because 40 titled the Team List Tuesday this week, the post, Turfus Repairus edition.
Need a little bit of Harry Potter magic, don't we?
Yeah, magic round. The focus is certainly on the turf there on Suncorp Stadium. Will that ground hold up? Clint, what's your takes, mate? Is it going to hold up? We're the last match of the weekend. Are we going to be playing on some sort of sand pit or just a bog of some sort by then?
It kind of feels that way, Suncorp hasn't been in the best of condition coming into Magic Round. There's been some questions about the quality of the surface there prior to Magic Round taking place. The fact that there's going to be every other game this round preceding it before we got there. I've been apprehensive about Magic Round for a couple of weeks now, gents. You don't want to never want to wish injury upon anyone, but you always worry about Magic Round and being the last game as we are, because it almost creates the perfect storm of conditions that's conducive to creating injuries, and let's all collectively knock on wood and hope that doesn't happen for either side. We want a good contest with a Parramatta victory, of course. But I've been incredibly nervous about this one for a couple of weeks, gents, and I worry there'll be a cow paddock out there and something that's not too akin to some of the fields that our national football side, soccer side, the Socceroos play that in World Cup qualifiers in years gone by. I got concerns.
40, do you share Clint's concerns?
Mate, we were there at Jack's Bar and Grill doing our live post-game show with the amazing Michael Butner, and we had the Souths Broncos game up in the background, and you have the projector behind us, but the TV's in front of us, so you could see the game happening as we were talking, and it was Divot City for the lone game of round 9, and we have 7 more games to play before the Eels and Titans take the field. It is fair to say that I am deeply concerned, because you look at our team, Gufferson, Sevo, we got Dunster, Hodgson, Dury, who isn't in the 17.
That's right.
Count his blessings, but Andrew Davey.
Yes.
I'm just trying to think if anyone else has had any major, like they're all the major knee guys off the top of my head. But you also stretch out to Dury in the extended roster too, and you get real concerned. All it takes is just one bad turn when you plant that foot, let alone having 2 or 3 100+ kilo monsters draped over you in all sorts of weird angles. So very, very concerned. I don't know, like it just. The NRL's known about this problem for months now. Like the Suncorp turf was struggling from like rounds 2 or 3, and this isn't a surprise. So it's not.
I mean, that's what's frustrating, isn't it? Because you want to see some type of proactive action addressing these concerns, and that's probably ultimately where our shared worry comes from. Is that there doesn't seem to have been, or at the very least, if there has, it hasn't been actively communicated that there's been work done to mitigate this.
And maybe as a concept, Magic Round needs to be, it can be in the one city, but, each of the 2 major days, because obviously the Saturday and Sunday action is completely different to the Friday in terms of the games played, needs to be spread around different grounds. So if it was in Sydney, you could have your Saturday at CommBank and then your Sunday at the new Allianz Stadium. Or if it's in Brisbane, you can have you want to have the big day, whichever one it is, let's say it's Sunday, at Suncorp. But then the Saturday goes to, the Gold Coast doesn't quite work there because it is a fair trip, but another venue somewhere. You just got to figure out how to balance it because clearly the turf is not holding up at Suncorp. And as fun a gimmick as Magic Round is, and it's obviously been a pretty viable commercial proposal because otherwise the NRL would have abandoned it by this point. It's obviously doing a good job. It just feels like we are so close to having like black Magic Round in terms of like a disaster. Like at some point it's going to happen.
We're being taking the viewpoint of as Eels supporters with our team playing last, but of course Titans fans would be feeling similarly. I can't remember what the other match is that's on the Sunday, but they're going to have their own concern. In fact, the last match on each day is going to have its concerns, let alone the first match on each day, because as you just referenced, 40, that the turf was tearing up during that Broncos and Souths game from last Friday night. So it's just going to be, let's hope, if not pray, that no players in any team get injuries that are a result of the conditions of the turf, because I'm sure that the clubs will be in absolute uproar if that's the case. And when it comes down to it, and I take a similar stance to this as what I do with the Darwin situation. The game itself in this instance should not be making the match conditions harder for players, or in this case, potentially more dangerous for players to participate in. I think there's a duty of care there, and if anything untoward were to happen as a result of the turf, it could be a fair argument that there was a distinct lack of duty of care because of the fact that everyone knows what the condition of the grass is in there. So anyway, we move on because we had one of the biggest upsets of the season, if not for many seasons, last week when the Tigers defeated the Panthers out in the bush, and it was horribly raining conditions. It was a close fought game. But I ask, is this an indication that the Tigers have found the way to win games, or is it an indication that the Panthers are not the team that they were?
I think that they played in probably the greatest leveling conditions that you're going to get this year in that torrential downpour, which completely usurped Penrith's ability to move the ball effectively. And to their credit, the West Tigers dug their heels in, squared their shoulders up, and got to work, and that's why they won that game. They just played simple, tough, and physical football. And like we're saying, like we're saying with the Eels, when you play physical football, you're going to put yourself in the contest far more often than you're not. And that was the case of the West Tigers. They did the job. And yes, it took Penrith playing fairly shocking football, but credit to Appius Coruscant, who dragged that team downfield at times by himself. He is having a pretty tremendous season considering how poor his supporting cast has been up until this game. But yeah, the Tigers, like I said, to their credit, showed a bit of guts. And Penrith, in a way, got rolled. They probably were expecting to just, to breeze past the Tigers. And when they showed a bit of starch and a bit of solidarity towards the other players on the West Tigers side, that is, Penrith really struggled for answers.
Clint, can the Tigers back it up and beat, I think it's the Dragons they're playing this week?
Well, to me, gents, the Tigers haven't been as poor as an 0-7 team usually is. And what I mean by that is there's some players having some decent performances, some forwards making meters and making their tackles. I think the series of last 3 or 4 games, they've dominated possession. So from a metrics perspective, they've been hitting their mark. But, as we touched on, those conditions really preventing Penrith from being able to move the ball. And, that might have just given the Tigers the defensive edge they need. And, we touched on it with the New South Wales Cup. Sometimes you just need one win, and that gives you the confidence to go on and get another. That might be the case with the Tigers. They're coming up against a very desperate St. George side this weekend, and it's probably the best time for the Tigers to get them is straight after that victory over the Panthers. Penrith were obviously missing some players, and the conditions didn't work in their favour. But they're also not the side that they were last year. I think they've got a handful of players returning this week. James Fisher-Harris is one of them. He obviously adds a lot of steel and starch to their pack, but I think it's a case of both sides of the argument here, gents, in that the Tigers. The Tigers were much improved, and they took advantage of the conditions that suits the style of players that are in their team. Likewise, the Panthers struggled in the conditions, and there was probably a little bit of newspaper headlines in the mind of the Panthers players just expecting to roll past the Tigers. Wasn't the case.
Yep. Now another incident to come out of the weekend was the Josh Reynolds swearing and confrontation with the referee Grant Atkins in the Bulldogs clash with the Dragons. I want to comment on this first because I put the question out there on Twitter about whether Josh Reynolds, his competitiveness crosses the line from an asset for the team into a liability. Now, I put that question immediately out at halftime as this incident had first unfolded, and it was a question that's been raised to some headlines this week in terms of should he have been sin binned, which would then mean yes, that would have been a major liability for the Bulldogs. My concern out of this, however, is that there have been commentators jumping to the defence of Josh Reynolds. Now, the way that I see it, and I'm not a prude in any way, shape or form, but he's used language at the match official. That's a bit of an issue. However, I think the biggest issue is he actually has no right to go and challenge the referee or to have a go at the referee about his decisions. He's not the captain of the team. So for him to actually put his team at risk of him being sent to the sin bin for dissent on the referee's calls is not the sign of a leader in the team. I mean, he's one of the most senior players in the NRL these days. So he ran that risk. He spoke today about he takes pride in being a role model in the game and he regrets the language that he uses, but he doesn't really regret challenging the referee about the call because he said it was the heat of the moment. Tell me how that's any different to using bad language at the referee when you're talking about being a role model for the kids. What sort of player who's not the captain, who has no right to go and address the referee, is setting an example to children in the game if he's going to behave like that? John, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if a player vents their frustration to the air when there's some tough decisions, That's one thing. You know, you expect players in the heat of the moment to sometimes let their emotions, you know, bubble out like that. But if you're coming into the referee's face and screaming, that's BS. You know, and like you said, he's not the captain, and so even on the grounds, just going to the referee in the first place is almost grounds for a sin bin, because you know you have no rights as a player to be challenging the referee, let alone, you know, screaming, like not like it's a awful exploitative, but it's an exploitative nonetheless. You know, screaming it in his face aggressively, then should have been sin binned. NRL should have had the referees back to the match at the MRC afterwards, and I think it's a terrible like precedent or image to have for the young players in the game. It's something you want to be cracking down on, because people do feed off that sort of thing, unfortunately. And if they're seeing,
Clint? Yeah, sorry, John.
No, I was saying, if they're seeing Josh Reynolds do it, they'll be saying, "Well, I can do it."
Yep, Clint.
I want to preface what I'm going to say with that. I like Josh Reynolds as a player, and you know, I think he's been a good player for Canterbury over the years, and you know, his return to that club after a number of years out of it is a feel good news story. You know, he's been a part of the identity of the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs for some time, even in his absence. However, you can't have it both ways, and you can't be a role model just when it's easy. Arguably, you're actually a role model when it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Good words.
And Josh failed the test there.
Yep.
You know,
it's easy to be the role model when things are easy.
It's easy to take the photos and have the words with the kids when, you know, it's the off season or after a victory. It's hard when it happens after a loss. It's hard when the team is struggling. You know, and I might call reference to something that happened in the Premier League over the last couple of days. And this actually happened with the Premier League team I support, Leeds United, who are in a very fierce relegation battle at the moment, and certainly took a step closer towards relegation after a heavy loss at the hands of Bournemouth. And there was a number of fans who were, after that match, were waiting to get photos with the Leeds players, who just could not be any more interested in what was going on. Now, look, that's not to say that there aren't role models that exist there within that club either, but they failed their test at that moment. It's easy to do things when the club's winning. It's easy to do things when everything is going well. What's not easy is when you're going through difficult times, when you're being challenged, when you're losing. And in those heat of the moment, those things do happen in the heat of the moment, as it did with Josh Reynolds. But that's the real test. That's when you are asked whether you're a role model or not at other moments.
And speaking of being put to the test and how you react when you're put to the test, we've seen that Zach Lomax has been dropped by Coach Griffin from the St George team this week, and it's been reported that Griffin didn't give him a reason for being omitted from the team, but also that the reason that may be the case is that Lomax, inverted commas, didn't take the decision well. And that was quite a bit of discussion that was on NRL 360 tonight, with Paul Kent reporting that Zach Lomax did not take kindly to the news. So, I mean, how do you feel about a player like that? I've received lots of messages via social media tonight saying, should we chase Lomax now? Is he the player that the Eels should chase? Now, my take on this is, first of all, he's under contract. So he's under contract, till the end of 26?
26.
Something like that. I don't see St George releasing a player who is under contract till the end of 26, when in all likelihood the coach is going to be moved on at the end of 23. So the player's around for 3 more years than what the coach is, and that's if the coach sees out his time. But secondly, there's also the question mark as to whether, if reports are true that the player did not take too kindly to the news, do you want a player that doesn't handle those sort of situations of adversity? Clint, what's your thoughts here, mate?
Obviously, this is all speculative, that he did have that reaction. But let's
Of
run
course, yeah. Yep.
as though it's true and he did have a negative response to that news. The answer to your question, Sixties, would be absolutely not. You know, these are players who are out there in the trenches. They're out there fighting the war each and every week. You know, and the second that something doesn't go their way, that's part and parcel of the job. That comes with the territory. It's an occupational hazard. You know, these things could happen at the drop of a hat. You got a coach there that's fighting for his career, and you know, we've argued over the previous weeks that it's a losing battle. You know, he's probably going to throw the kitchen sink and try whatever he can and whatever he believes might work for the team that week to try and keep his job. You know, so part of being a professional athlete is accepting these decisions, seeking feedback, asking on what you can work on, and trying to earn that reprieve and get your way back into the side. You know, and no player, no matter their status, is exempt from those discussions. You know, so I think you know, if this is in fact what's happened, Zach might look back at this moment with a little bit of remorse. You know, it's part of growing up. We've got to keep in mind that he's still a young man himself, but he's been around the game long enough to know what's expected of him as well. You know, so I'm not going to give him the out just because he's younger. You know, he's getting paid a good salary there at St. George. So he needs to carry himself like someone that's paid a good salary, and that comes with the expectation of a degree of professionalism.
Yep, John.
It's easy to be enamored with the talent that players like Zach Lomax possess, and so when something sets them back at their club, immediately you sort of, like I used that term before, it's like chum in the water, right? For all the Sharks, everyone starts getting in a frenzy. Let's go get him. Let's sign him. And you know, I think even myself at times I've said, yeah, well, surely Brad After will get the best out of Zach Lomax, but there's a couple of things you got to consider. Is obviously the character test that you were talking about there, boys, and whether he's passed or failed them, being in the trenches with a team that's struggling and how he's responded to those pressures. And also just looking at our team, Zach Lomax's struggles are because he is playing at left centre for St. George Illawarra. He is a natural right centre. He comes to Parramatta and he's still going to have his struggles on the left edge. And is he going to really unseat the young centre that's been a tour de force in the NRL this year in Will Penasini? Like, do you move Will Penasini and everything he's doing on the right edge for Zach Lomax? I know. Like, yeah, exactly. Yep. You get, like, with Lomax, you get a nice backup goal kicker and the potential to play maybe fullback in a pinch too. But yeah, it's like I said, it's so easy to be a number with the talent he possesses, but how much of his problems are personal, how much of his problems are the struggles of the St. George Dragons, I don't know. If you're a talent evaluator and you're paid for that, you've got to extricate that from the mess that is St. George and figure out whether he's worth going to, because from the outside looking in, for me, I'd say it's a pass.
Yeah, and I think ultimately for any club and therefore for any coach where he might potentially be a player, and that's for the incoming coach at St. George, probably ahead of anyone else, is whether you feel, whether that coach feels that he is a talent that they can work with. And they'd only know that from doing their due diligence or talking to people that they know that have worked with the player. There can be things that might be going on in a player's personal life that could be impacting their form and their temperament.
Signing Zach Lomax isn't signing Zach Lomax for 2023 as your X factor. It's signing him till the end of 2026. So you're essentially taking on a Wonga Blake 2.0 contract. That sort of commitment for 3-4 years. So you got to figure out whether he fits not just for now but in the long term.
Yeah. And as I said, that's basically for any club that might be considering approaching him, or when the Dragons work out what's going to happen. And it may well be that maybe Anthony Griffin was thinking the same thing as what the great Jack Gibson used to think with Brett Kenny, where he would reach a point in the season where he'd want him to rest for a week. And, as Brett told us, when he said he really didn't want to do that, and Gibbo said to him, well, you can go and introduce yourself to the reserve grade coach if you don't want to take a week.
Load management is a real thing in the NBA. And with the NRL season getting longer and grindier than ever, we're probably not that far off from legitimate load management coming into the game and looking at players that could use that week off here or there in order to get them back to 100% or keep them mentally fresh.
Well, as Clint spoke about before, that could be part of that decision-making around the team this
The
week.
2-week lag on Darwin, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. But let's move out to other more interesting off-field issues at a club, and that's Manly with the Schuster and Madison blow up.
Dean Madison, of course, Ryan's younger brother.
Dean Madison, the younger brother of Ryan Madison,
and
in
Dean front of the
himself,
coach. Like that,
Yep.
This was at this, not in the game. It was in front of the coach, with other players present too.
Yeah. Now Dean, of course, came through the pathways at Parramatta just as Ryan did, and Dean was also someone who had quite a bit to do with the Giant Step School and working with young people on the spectrum. He played with Parramatta up until the NYC competition finished, I think. Was it the last year of the NYC competition that was his
2017, yeah.
year? I'm pretty sure that was the case. He's been running around in New South Wales Cup for Mounties last year from memory.
I think he might have been at Blacktown too, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, he's now at Blacktown again with the with the Manly connection there, and of course he's had the blow up with Josh Schuster.
And so I'm looking into the situation. Apparently, I might be wrong about this, but apparently Schuster has a prank, and I use that term very loosely, where he stands behind someone and then smacks them on the back of the neck or the backside of the head. And I think Madison might have been his victim a couple of times. And understand we didn't take a liking to being pranked, again, loosely, in that such a nature, and took exception. So,
well, given that it was at a team barbecue, and the apologists are saying, look, and even the Manly players themselves, as you'd expect they might,
putting out
have come out and said,
exactly.
look, look, it's no big deal for players to have a bit of a blow up between themselves, or this can happen in opposed sessions, and that can happen in opposed sessions, and sometimes we have to pull players apart and what have you. And look, I have no doubt that happens, but I don't know how often it happens. I can tell you how much Parramatta Eels training that I've watched, and I'm not talking about the anything that might happen in the in their contact work in the wrestling room, because that may well be where things fire up the most, and maybe there's been blow-ups there over the years. But in the last 10 years of watching Eels training, I can genuinely say I've only ever seen one blow-up that, if players didn't sort of step between a couple of blokes, that it might have fired up a little bit. But the two players themselves never came to blows, because one was sort of moving away and the other one was running after him, not over a distance, but because the players very quickly grabbed the person who wasn't too happy, and they settled down, and the two blokes walked off. At the end of the session, there weren't any issues with them. They were talking to each other and what have you. But that's all I've ever seen at the Eels. Now, maybe the Eels are a bit of an exception, and we have read incidents over the years where players have come to blows. But I think when that's happened, there's been some genuine bad blood from what I can remember. Is there an issue at the Sea Eagles, do you think?
Well, I think we saw last year there was an issue at the Sea Eagles, and they chose to side with the young sort of talent in the club and go with a new coach and empower the young talent. And it turns out it's a pretty loose ship. So, yeah, I'm not surprised that there is immaturity in their playing ranks. So, yeah.
Clint, you played up to a level where you were part of development squad at the Eels. In your years of playing football, how often did you see blow-ups between teammates?
Well, it's part and parcel of a physical sport that there would be, there's a lot of testosterone going around on the field out there as well. We're talking about athletes physically exerting themselves
in the heat of moment blow-ups
capacity.
Happen, absolutely, when you're playing a contact sport. And like 60 said, when you're running attack versus defense, you're getting physical. You're going to get high shots and hard blows that cause people to flare up. But yeah, when it's stuff off the field, that's when you start getting concerned.
And that was the segue I was going to make, and this wouldn't be news if Josh Schuster wasn't already in the news for other reasons. It's when you start tugging at that thread that some of this information comes out, and you have to kind of wonder who leaks this information and what their what might be the driving reason for that.
That's
Josh
a very
good
point. Yeah, that's a very good point, because if this is just at a team barbecue, were there outsiders there that have leaked that? Was it someone inside the club that's leaked it? Has one of the players leaked it to a mate who's then leaked it to another mate, blah, blah, blah? We don't know, because that's where you start to think, is there something to this story getting out?
Possibly, and to use the phrase that 40 said before, from the outside looking in, it's painting a certain picture about what's going on at Manly, and you compound that with what took place at the end of last year, and the way that Des Hasler departed the club. There's the Anthony Seibold, yes, still has some of his critics in the wider rugby league world, given what took place during his tenure at Brisbane. There's all these little sub elements to these stories that in lieu of the dots being connected, people start to connect their own dots, and sometimes it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy really quickly. Manly's going to have to tread very carefully in terms of how it manages its PR moving forward, because the longer that this stuff goes on and continues to come out, faster their season will derail, just like it did last year.
And speaking of Manly, we see one of Manly's favourite families, or I shouldn't say favourite families, but an important family, the Fulton family. Scott Fulton has now taken up a position with the West Tigers. And I mean, it's interesting that he's moved from the northern beaches to a role out in southwestern Sydney, where he was actually poaching players from for the Manly team. But then on top of everything else, because we're talking about the West Tigers, we then have the scenario where the football club knew nothing about it.
The chairman and the CEO have acted rogue. Lee Haggard-the-Pantelus and Justin Pascoe have operated in the dark without informing the head of football, Tim Sheens, and just said, yeah, by the way, here's your new recruitment guy, head of recruitment.
And that Pagimantalis, he's justified. He has no problem whatsoever that the coaching staff were clueless about it. I mean, besides all of that, like Warren McDonald, he's going to be shoved out by that move. And again, you're talking about people who have relationships within the football club, and there's a decision that's made without consultation to them. And is it little wonder that the West Tigers have had issues that seem to be ongoing, and the problems that seem to be caused by the board and the executives within that club? It's just astounding. It's like, I mean, I'm just glad that we're not seeing this sort of stuff that's happening around the Eels. That's all I'll say.
And it's I was trying to think. I think I saw somewhere that Tim Sheens had rehired someone that Pascoe had fired twice in the past on separate occasions.
Goodness.
So maybe this was a means of getting back. I don't know. Like,
let's say hypothetically that that's the
it was McDonald. It was McDonald.
A means of getting back.
It was McDonald. So
what? Excuse my language, gents, but what type of shit show is that? These are the leaders and executive managers of the club. They should be meeting with each other with some form of regularity, consulting on these decisions. And it's not up to the chairman, who really shouldn't be in the day-to-day. Their concerns are with the board and ensuring that the CEO is executing the strategy and supporting the CEO and able to achieve that. They shouldn't be in the day-to-day operations like that. And,
I mean, Clint, in what world does a board make a decision? I mean, even if
they shouldn't. They shouldn't. That's not their purpose.
And
yeah,
given
but not even a consultation, not even a heads up. Like it's just straight out. By the way, Scott Fulton's now working with you.
given the covert nature of it all on both sides, as much as like him going from Manly and the Tigers not really knowing he was coming on board, you got to wonder if promises were made about expeditious raids on Manly talent and guaranteeing. Well, I use the term blue chip very loosely because Manly aren't doing too flash in the juniors this year, but securing some of the best talent from Manly.
Yeah, well, it's whatever it is. You can just. It just feels like it's more of the same from the West Tigers, and where they may have taken one step forward with their football performance on the weekend, you can't help but feel that the board is helping them or pushing them towards taking two steps backwards. So,
look, they're not aligned, gents, clearly, and it's to reference four-quadrant leadership. It seems as though some of the executives within that club like to go quadrant 1 leadership on decisions that should be quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, in that they should be consultative, and a group decision is what determines the outcome, as opposed to rogue executives saying my way or the highway, like it or lump it. You can't successfully operate that way in rugby league. There's too much interdependency.
It's almost comical on a cosmic level for poor West Tigers fans too, because they get their breakthrough win against the back-to-back reigning premiers in torrid conditions, things looking like they could be on the up, and then you deal fish it. Like, good Lord.
Yeah, and we're not suggesting in any way that they've made the wrong appointment with
just
Scott
the process
Fulton,
is terrible.
No, it's the manner.
It might be the complete opposite. It's it's astounding the methodology that's been involved in it. Now, just to wrap things up, it sort of flew under the radar a little bit with me, but South copped a fine for having a 14th player on the field during their victory over the Brisbane Broncos. How long was that for?
53rd minute for, I want to say 30 or 40 seconds maybe, or maybe close to a minute.
Okay. Now, there was no try scored during that period.
And the game was pretty much well and truly over by that point too, I'm pretty certain. I think Souths had piled on a fair margin. I just go back to their game recap, which was on Friday night, so I have to go back a little bit further. So yeah, they only scored 2 more tries after that point. So
okay, so we're happy with that call. It's a common sense call.
Yeah,
but where does the line get drawn where a team might be at risk of losing competition points?
Yeah, it's a fair question, because you're talking about margin of victory, windows of scoring in relation to the substitution. So if any points are scored when the player's on the field, I think it's immediate grounds for suspension of competition points. But yeah, in this case, South got very lucky that it was a game beyond doubt at that point, because in a closer game, even changing field position because you've got one player advantage, that sort of cascading butterfly effect, like how do you evaluate it?
Yeah, well, if there's an extended period of defence, like if that period, which might give the best part of a set of 6, if that was in defence and you're able to hold out,
have a fullback and a full 13-man defensive line.
Correct. Like you start to get into, as you said, that cascading effect of, okay, they were prevented from scoring here. What would a try at this point for the opposition have meant, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I just wonder if they got guidelines, like distinct guidelines for this down at the NRL, or are they basically flying by the seat of their pants with when they have to make a decision on it? Like, is there just no firm and fast rule that they apply?
It's a good question.
It's a shame that it happened before we had it, or why we were chatting to Mick Buton and we weren't aware of it. 60s, it would have been a fantastic question to parlay onto him in terms of his experience in the MRC?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Are there hard and fast guidelines, or they just sit down and look at the context of the game in any given circumstance and say, yeah, I mean, Souths were never going to lose, so let's just fine them? Or going back to, I think it was West Tigers versus Bulldogs, they had the extra player on in the final minutes of that game, and I think they initially took the competition points away. I don't know if they were restored under appeal. There was one game that they restored points under appeal. So, yeah, it's a very interesting situation where, yeah, is there reference material for this stuff, or they sort of just play it case by case and by the year?
Well,
the thing that sorry, gents. I was just going to say the thing that resonates with me with this is one of the themes in the use of language we see the NRL regularly use is denying a team the opportunity of X. Now, when you're referencing there before about a 13-man defensive line with a fullback behind them, Brisbane effectively are being denied the opportunity to play against an even playing field. Is that the baseline for establishing this stuff? Obviously, there's a lot of mitigating factors, and to the points that you both made, I think all of those things need to be taken into consideration, as well as the duration in which a 14th man is on the field. But if we want to try and call out for consistency, by virtue of decisions that the on-field officials and the NRL make around a lot of things that take place on the field in their post-weekly review, it's the language that regularly gets used is denying the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that Souths were lucky that it occurred at a time when I think they pretty much had possession during that, and if it had gone longer and they were defending a full set with an extra player advantage, that might start to, maybe that crosses the line. But this is the thing, we just don't know. We just don't know what the line in the sand is for the NRL, where it crosses from being fine worthy into worthy of losing competition points. Do they define it by the period of time that it lasts for? Do they define it by the impact or the loss of opportunity for a team that's created by the extra person out there on the field, no matter how long it is that they're out there? I mean, if they're out there for 5 minutes before it's picked up, and heaven forbid that would ever be the case, that a team could have an extra player for anything longer than a few seconds, because you think there has to be someone out there, an interchange official or someone like someone that's looking at their own bench, goes, uh-oh, we've got not enough players here on the bench. Joe Bloggs is out there on the field. He's supposed to be sitting here. Like, you'd think that there's enough checks to make sure that doesn't happen, but there have been incidents over the years, albeit for seconds. So you'd like to think that there is a hard and fast rule, but I guess in this instance we can be thankful that there was a common sense approach that was adopted by the NRL. Well, fellas, another bumper news episode. We've got through it.
Some way, somehow. Yeah, the news cycle never ends in the NRL. It just churns and churns and churns. So thankfully there hasn't been, and I knock on wood, there hasn't been any big off-field dramas. We've just got the on-field dramas now, which is the best kind of drama.
Yeah, and Clint, thanks for joining us again once more for our news episode. Thanks again to Big Swing Golf at Northmead, and for Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan and Parramatta. And of course, don't forget that we will be at Parramatta Leagues Club in Jack's Bar and Grill Sunday afternoon for the big clash between the Eels and the Titans. We'll do a bit of a pre-game. We'll do our post-match reactions there. Get down to Parramatta Leagues Club as a live site where you, as Parramatta supporters, if you haven't made the interstate trip up there to Brisbane, if you want to be joining other Eels supporters and having a bit of an atmosphere in watching the game, then get down there to the home of the Eels. John, mate, you've done brilliantly as usual. Clint, champion. And all I have to say, mate, is go you Eels.